But that's the other thing I really delved into. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent now, but I'm allowed to because that's what people love, tangents, don't they? And that's one another thing is how scared they were during the Simnel crisis. And actually, Elizabeth, Henry, and Margaret Beaufort, Henry's mother, gather in the Midlands for an emergency summit. We don't know what they discussed, but thereafter, Elizabeth, the Queen, heads straight to Arthur, and it looks like preparations were in place to evacuate the Queen and the Prince to the continent to set up, probably to keep him alive and to set up a rival court. Henry knew full well about rival courts on the continent. And I think that's interesting that although they've been married only just over a year, there's already enough trust in Elizabeth to handle and protect the future of the Tudor dynasty. Of course, it's her dynasty as well now. But even with all this sort of Yorkist opposition, a house that Elizabeth's associated with, the couple were already close enough to be able to completely trust each other with something like that. And I think Elizabeth's coronation was a celebration, at least to some extent, of Henry's love for his own wife. And I don't think it was just politically motivated, though it's Tudor times. How do you ever separate love and politics?
True, and but just going back to you were saying about the Earl of Warwick and being able to produce the real, it always reminds me now how true it is. I don't know, but we've talked about the White Princess a little bit earlier. It always reminds me of in the BBC did the Shadow of the Tower series in the 70s, and it shows these events, and it shows the real Earl of Warwick, the child being taken to parade through the streets, and then when he gets back to the tower, they take off all his coronet and his fine robes and everything, and then they put him into, because he's been until this stage he's been in sort of fairly comfortable lodgings. He's taken to what is essentially a prison cell, shown to be a prison cell, although let's face it was made in the 70s, so it does look as though it's made out of cardboard. And and then he starts banging on the door saying, "I'm the Earl of Warwick, let me out," and it does look as though there's an earthquake happening. But that image is always in my mind, and just on that series as well, I think that series does captures the essence of Henry and Elizabeth's characters at this time really well, because you have Elizabeth knowing that she's the heir, saying, "I am Elizabeth of York," and she says this several times to Cecily, and then they're talking about Henry after he's taken the throne at Bosworth, and she's saying, "Oh, he'll have to come a wooing, and I may not give my consent." And then it becomes clear that he's going to be crowned without her, and then suddenly she's much less cocky, she's much less sure of herself, and then it does appear to be, a political settlement to their marriage, but then as the time progressed and the episodes got, it is shown to be, if not necessarily a love match, certainly a partnership and an equal partnership between the two of them. Well, as equal as it can be with, he's the king, but there's mutual love and affection and trust between them. We can all assess and judge how accurate these dramas are, but I think that sort of captures that. That's the best one that I've ever seen capture the essence of their characters. And because of course they're far, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York are far less well known, certainly as the other Tudors later, and so I think that they're ripe for. There's more speculation about how they may or may not have felt about each other, because we simply don't have as much information as we do in the later Tudor period.
No, we don't, which I think is probably both a blessing and a curse. I mean, I guess when you're talking about, and I get asked quite a lot, because I write a lot about Henry VII stuff, and I often get asked, were Henry VII and Elizabeth of York really in love? Probably because of, to an extent, shows like that, like what I forgot the name. What's the show you were just talking about?
Shadow of the Tower.
Shadow of the Tower. But of course, more recently, probably because of the White Queen, White Princess stuff. And of course, the point I always make is you can't really know how well your best friends feel about one another. If you're friends with a couple, you don't truly know what's going on in their hearts. And, we've all been in that situation where a couple have broken up and no one knew there were even any problems. So how on earth can you really say what a couple who lived 500 years ago who you never met felt about each other. And of course you can't. But I agree with you that there's a partnership, and that it's a partnership that seems more than a begrudging one, if that makes sense. And like I was saying earlier, that evidence, because I think people have always known that it became that later on, or there's evidence it did. But again, writing about Arthur, I realized, no, it's there. It's there in the first 18 months of their marriage. You know, Henry's not sending his mother with Arthur to the continent to establish a rival court. He's not sending his uncle. You know, he's not sending the Earl of Oxford. Now, arguably, of course, she'd send the mother with the boy. But that's a huge position of trust. I should say, I mean, we don't know for a fact that that's exactly what the plan was, but it seems to be what the plan was, piecing it together. So please, people listening, don't quote me that we know 100% that's what the plan was, but it seems likely. And then you see, of course, years later, Arthur's death. Obviously, I'm looking at this through the prism of Arthur because I've just written about him. But when Arthur dies, there's a very detailed Herald account of their reaction. It's emotional, it's moving, it's personal. And Elizabeth comforts Henry by saying, we are still young enough to have more children, which you could look at as quite cold, but I don't think that's the right way to look at it at all. It's about trying to put your best foot forward. And she later goes into her chamber and then completely collapses. She comforts him, then she goes away and can finally grieve as a mother. But when she says to him, we can have more children, she knows what she is saying, which is that she will put her life at risk, because having a child is a risk for any woman in the early 16th century. She's had terrible pregnancies, and it looks as if the couple had made a deliberate decision to start having children in recent years because her last one seems to have been particularly hard on her. So she knows she's getting into her late 30s.
Which, of course, isn't, you know, even though she says we're still young, that's not young by Tudor standards. I mean, it's still relatively young by today's standards, but by Tudor standards, that's quite old.
She means it's possible, you know. She's not, and she knows the risk, and it's huge. Now, yes, that's a dynastic commitment, but just the fact that she's thrown her whole self into what I call Project Tudor, this new dynasty for England, that in of itself is telling. But to think that there's not a human aspect to that, I think, would be to deliberately take a cold hermeneutic on the available sources, shall we say.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing to say about Elizabeth and her character is that even though there is that Yorkist support and it never entirely dies away, there will always be certain sections who are sympathetic to the Yorkist cause, who accept Henry begrudgingly. She never does anything to court their support. She never does anything to act outside the king's interest, outside the king's sphere of influence. She doesn't try and attract attention of herself. She doesn't, she's I suppose if one were being cold-hearted about it, one would say that she becomes entirely supplicant to her husband, but I'm not sure that it is entirely that. I think it's more likely that she realizes that although yes, there would be some power, it would throw the whole nation into disarray. She's lived through rebellion and war, and she probably doesn't want to see all of that again. It's more of a realpolitik rather than necessarily she's having to become entirely, to lose her own character or anything like that.
I think you're spot on. I mean, she would have grown up with stories about this horrific, evil queen, Margaret of Anjou, who was waiting in France to come back and ruin their reign, their home, their stability. And she would have heard about she was a terrible woman because she dominated her husband and all the rest of it. A historian would know that Margaret of Anjou had no choice other than to dominate her husband because he was entirely inactive. And then she would have seen, to a less extreme extent, but still to a very real extent, her mother's own more dominant style of queenship, which she may have, we don't know, she may have attributed to part of the problems with what went wrong and that led to the destruction of her brothers. She may have done, because it was It was a reluctance to see her mother's family take power that caused Richard to get some early political support. Richard III, I'm talking about. So Elizabeth's heard these horror stories. She's seen a style from her mother that she may have questions about, although maybe she doesn't. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if she just thinks this isn't the way to get the kind of stability that we want.